There is no question, there was no doubt. Technically speaking with Hi Sam. Hey y'all, it's Nat. I hope you're having a terrific day today. And for this video, we're going to be wrapping up my 2025 fantasy subreddit bingo board. All right, so before I get into anything bookish, make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. And you gotta tell me in the comments if you partook in this challenge, how did you do? And what was the best book you read from your board? All right, so you may have seen my racing to finish this bingo board, and I actually managed to do so. So we are 2 for 2 on me not only completing these boards, but also completely blacking it out. Very proud of myself. And of course, to celebrate reading what would normally be 25 books, but this time it's 24 books, gotta go through and talk about all of the books I read, and I'm going to give quick little one-sentence-ish reviews for each of them. So starting at the top with the first prompt, which was Knights and Paladins. Obviously to have a main character who falls into one of these two categories, but hard mode was where the protagonist has an oath or a promise that they need to keep. I wasn't necessarily sure a Star Wars book was going to work, but thankfully it did. I ended up reading The Tears of the Nameless by George Mann, which is part of the High Republic section of the Star Wars universe. I really loved getting to see how one of my favorite Padawan characters has really grown throughout this series, but as far as the plot went, I don't think this really did much. So it is a good thing I'm a character reader. This was 4 stars. Next up was to read A Hidden Gem, a book that had less than 1,000 ratings on Goodreads. Unfortunately, I did not manage to complete the hard mode version of this, but I read The Folklore of Forever by Sarah Hogle, and it's really ironic that I did this because I had the first book in this series on my TBR for last year's board, only to then read the book and realize, wait, this isn't actually fantasy. And yet the second book in the series, there is no question, there was no doubt, it was 100% fantastical. And this was honestly one of the most chaotic books I have ever read. I was not sure what happened for like the last 25% of this book, but it was funny. 3 stars. Then I was foiled again by my need to consistently pick up new books. So when it came to reading a book that was published in the 1980s, I did have a harder time with this prompt. Hard mode was that the book was written by an author of color, and I did manage to complete that. I ended up reading Hadriana and All My Dreams by Renee DePestri. And honestly, I think my biggest thing with this book is like the synopsis that I was sold. I mean, yes, that is what happens in the book, but also it is not at all what the book is really about. This one was like a 2.75 stars. And then there was High Fashion, to read a book where clothing or fashion was really important to the story. But the hard mode was that one of the main characters actually either like creates pieces, utilizes fabric, something like that. And I was able to complete that one with Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. I think I probably would have loved this book a little bit more if it was more fleshed out. However, all in all, this was a very entertaining read. I had so much fun watching the story unfold, and the enemies to lovers romance definitely kept me glued in. A very strong 4 star. Last of the top row is Down with the System, to read a book where the plot revolves around the disabling of a system. Hard mode was not a government system, and I think technically I did manage to complete that with A Power Unbound by Freya Marsh, because technically speaking, without getting into too many spoilers, overarching plot of this series kind of breaks down like the magical system as they know it. And while yes, there is a government body that is included with that, but like the magical system itself is not necessarily a government body. So I think I managed to do this. And when it comes to a review, this book is solidified. Freya Marsh can do no wrong in my eyes. This was 5 stars. On to the next row with Impossible Places. And fun fact, this actually was completed by a different book initially until I realized I had accidentally doubled up on authors. So lucky for me, I realized one of the comics I had read would complete this. Basically, the setting of the story would break a physicist. So I ended up going with Red Lanterns Volume 2, The Death of the Red Lanterns by Peter Milligan. Overall, I would say this was a decent volume, but the finale does kind of have a Deus Ex Machina thing that I was not a big fan of. This was 3.5 stars. Then there was to read a book in parts where the text is broken down into different segments. Hard mode was that the book had more than 4 parts, and luckily The Stardust Grail by Yumi Kitase completed that. This is Indiana Jones meets Ocean's 9 set in space, and I was all over it. Very strong 4 stars. This next one was actually the reason that I had to change Impossible Places. So for Gods and Pantheons, basically to read a book where there's like a pantheon of gods. Hard mode though is there are multiple pantheons. I ended up going with Wild Reverence by Rebecca Ross, and all I have to say is Rebecca Ross is a favorite author for a reason. This was 5 stars. Next up was to read the last in a series. Big shout out to the moderators for making this a prompt because this was very helpful. Each time I have done these boards, I've started into so many series. It was really helpful to finish out a series. Hard mode was that the series had more than 4 books in it, so I actually ended up utilizing the last book in the High Republic section of the Star Wars universe, and that was Trials of the Jedi by Charles Soule. And honestly, this was a really mixed bag of an ending. Unfortunately, I just don't think this author in particular is my favorite. This was like a 3.75 stars. Last one on this row was to read a book club or read-along book, specifically from a book club or read-along on the fantasy subreddit. I did not participate in either of those, meaning I could not complete the hard mode, but I did still end up reading The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke, which was a prior pick. And this was a story that got just as messy as the characters involved in it, and I loved every second of it. 5 stars. Onto the middle row with a parent protagonist. Hard mode is that the child is also a main character in the story, and if memory serves, I think this was actually the first prompt I completed on the board, kind of accidentally, with Brotherhood by Mike Chen. And as much as I enjoyed this, I think my thoughts really can just be summed up by the fact that Mike Chen honored so many Star Wars memes, particularly around Anakin, and I must applaud him for that. This was 4.5 stars. Then we have epistolary, so a story that is told in an epistolary format, but hard mode is that the entire book is told in this style. Didn't actually plan for it, but luckily The Unworthy by Augustina Bastrica ended up working for this. And honestly, this was not really a very satisfying cult story. It was a sort of okay dystopian story. And across the board, I really would have appreciated if the author would have dived a little bit deeper into the climate horror. So this was 3 stars. Then we have published in 2025. Hard mode was that it was also a debut book. I ended up reading When the Tides Held the Moon by Vanessa Vita Kelly along with my Geek Squad book club over on my Patreon, which worked out so perfectly. Hi, Sam. I really loved the idea of this book, but unfortunately the execution did fall a little flat for me, so this turned out to be 3.5 stars. Next up is to read a book from an author of color, but hard mode was specifically to read a horror book, which was not a trial for me. I ended up reading Bat Eater by Kylie Lee Baker and loved it. This is literally a compilation of every little thing I love in horror put together. I adored it. 5 stars. Next up was to read a book from a small press or small publisher. Hard mode, I think, was that the story also had less than 100 ratings. Unfortunately, I did not complete that, I don't believe, but I did read Green Fuse Burning by Tiffany Morris, which has gorgeously atmospheric writing that encapsulates a grief horror story that honestly felt like a fever dream, and I really enjoyed it. 5 stars. On to the next row with Biopunk, and I had high hopes that I would get a different book read for this, but it ended up not happening, sadly. So I ended up counting Mickey 7 by Edward Ashton, which unfortunately only works for the easy version. This is like a sci-fi slice of life story, and even though there were relatively big stakes, it just never felt that way. So overall, it was okay. 3.5 stars. Then next up was Elves and or Dwarves. Hard mode was that one of the main characters is either Elvish or Dwarvish, and I finally ended up starting into Lord of the Rings. I've actually officially read all of Lord of the Rings as of this point, but we're gonna go ahead and say that I read Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien, and it is so funny to me that so much of this book is very reminiscent of cozy fantasy, something that I do not tend to enjoy, and maybe it's because I already know the stakes, but it just really worked for me here. This was a really strong 4-star. Next up was to read a LGBT plus protagonist. Hard mode is also that the main character is marginalized in some way apart from being queer, and I ended up reading Spellbound by F.T. Lukens, which is a really adorable romance mixed with a very fun paranormal mystery story that had a little bit of depth in both of the main characters and a light sprinkling of societal issues mixed in. It was overall just a really fun time. 4 stars. Next up is actually the one that I ended up using my replacement for, because short stories and we just don't really get along very often. So instead, I swapped this one out for, I think it was Superheroes was the prompt. I don't remember what year it came from, but I finally got around to reading Vicious by B.E. Schwab, which was so up my alley because it is superhero / supervillain related. And objectively, I can still appreciate that this was a very good book, but I bet I would have loved it if I had read it 5 years ago. 4 stars. Next up is Stranger in a Strange Land, and I did not think think I was going to be using this book here, but it actually ended up working rather perfectly. The Bones Beneath My Skin by TJ Klune. I love a good grump with a heart of gold, and especially when it's a kid that pulls that out of him. But adding a sci-fi twist and then putting them on the run from the government was definitely very interesting. 5 stars. On to the final roast, starting out with To Recycle, a prior bingo square, not to be confused with the one that we swapped out. So from the 2022 board, I ended up utilizing Standalone because that was just kind of easy. And I read The Midnight Girls by 𝗖cie heç𝘁𝘁. This was an original fantasy story based in Polish folklore that had a really lush world building and a very cute sapphic romance. So of course, across the board, I ended up loving it. 4.5 stars. Next up is cozy sci-fi fantasy. And as I was saying earlier, cozy, not usually my thing. So I was a little nervous going into this one. Hard mode was to read from an author who was new to you. And luckily, I had not read from Becky Chambers yet. So I finally got around to The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. I learned that, hey, maybe I can like cozies. Just sci-fi instead of fantasy. 4 stars. Then we had a generic title to read a book that had some sort of these words that are all very generic and get utilized quite often in the fantasy genre. Unfortunately, I did not end up completing the hard mode version, but I did read Certain Dirt Things by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. And I think this world of vampires was super cool and had some very interesting and original elements, but unfortunately it was never really won by the characters, so it was only 3.5 stars. And the next up was not a book. This was kind of a fun one, I gotta say. I appreciate that they tossed this in here, but it is to do something that is not reading a book. And for this one, I am counting the fact that I finally played D&D. I ended up doing a one-shot with Josh, my brother, and some friends, and it was a lot of fun. I do want to try again at some point. My schedule is just crazy as per usual. So completed that. And last but certainly not least was piracy. However, hard mode was to read a book where the pirates are not seafaring. So I read the next book following Lorna D in the Star Wars universe, Tempest Breaker by Cavan Scott. This character is truly one of my favorites from the Star Wars novels, and I want a TV show that is just following her, having some space pirate adventures. 5 stars. All right, and on that note, that is officially it for today, y'all. So thank you so much for coming to my channel. I really appreciate it. Make sure to hit like and subscribe down below. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, let's leave the green checkmark emoji in the comments down below. I have links to all of my socials, as well as a few ways you can support me down in the description. I come out with videos on Monday and Friday, but until then, I hope you continue to have a terrific day. Love you, bye!